Welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module called Contemporary Agrarian Crisis and Suicides in India. This particular module comes under the paper Classical Sociological Theory. Recent events, especially related to the agrarian sector, have revealed that there has been an increasing rate of suicide amongst the farmers and small landholders in rural areas. One wonders why this has been happening, especially post 1991, that is when the liberalization, privatization and globalization era began. Is it because that the markets were opened up and because the states cut down on subsidies that are leading to higher suicide rates in rural areas? Or is it because there is a growth of consumerism within the rural folk that leads to competition in terms of wealth creation that ultimately leads to egoistic kinds of suicide? Taking a cue from Durkheim's theory of suicide, various scholars debate what kind of genealogy or discourse can be applied to understand how suicide rates and why suicide rates have actually gone up in many agrarian parts of the country. And various kinds of theoretical propositions have been posited to understand this particular phenomena. We seem to have forgotten the well-known and acknowledged thoughts. The development of India lies in the development of villages. India lives in villages, and agriculture is the backbone of Indian economy. Our priorities and thrust areas of development have changed from agriculture to industry, information technology, mining, tourism, and urban life. Our emphasis is not anymore on sustainable development with equity. There is a creation of rural-urban divide due to poor budgetary allocations to agriculture and rural areas. The agriculture sector is suffering from number of problems like irregular power supply, inadequate irrigation, absence of storage facilities, lack of roads, transportations, etc. The farmers, being the major victims of these adverse currents of situation, understand the occupation more as a gamble with monsoon and inadequate resource, crop failures, rising cost of cultivation, declining returns from agriculture, and adverse impact of economic liberalization, and majorly pressure of indebtedness. This indicates that there is a need to call for a paradigm shift in our core areas of development. Despite several measures being taken by the government to address vital crises in agriculture economy, ineffective implementation of these policies and programs could not fetch desired results, but deepened the miseries further. The emerging agrarian unrest recently draws a significant number of farmers to take to the extreme step, suicide. Approximately 150,000 suicides were reported in India between the year 1995 and 2004, and the number continues to grow at a disturbing rate. This extreme measure that the peasantry has been driven to resort to has been reported from various parts of the country that includes major states like Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh and Punjab. The issues of such indebtedness, fragmentation of land, complete absence of any extension service, rising cost of inputs, shrinking subsidies and minimum support prices, disenchantment of younger generation of farmers to the occupation, market fluctuations, lack of institutional support in terms of availability of credits, rising unpredictability in the universe of agriculture, larger macro level factors, etc., emerge as a common set of problems that afflicts more or less all these erstwhile green revolution areas. The causes and nature of farmer suicides in India has now acquired attention from researchers worldwide. It is central to sociological tradition to identify and analyze these suicides. A scholarly approach to examining and explaining the cause of these suicides leads us to follow the theoretical framework based on Emile Durkheim's ideas penned in his classic work Suicide, 1897. The sociological paradigm that Durkheim's work offers us serves as a model to understand farmer suicides in India. It suggests that these suicides are compatible within two of the four types, egoism and anomic. Durkheim identifies four broad-based types of suicide: egoistic, altruistic, anomic, and fatalistic. Durkheim's work, operating on the concept of concomitant variables, explains these types and their causes based on two independent variables: social integration and social regulation. To Durkheim, egoistic suicide occurs due to social isolation, lack of adequate social integration, whereas anomic suicide results when social regulation is weak and there is a disproportion between aspiration and achievement. The two types of suicide provide necessary explanation in the light of various agrarian unrests that operated on socio-economic lives of the diseased farmers who were left to the gruesome vagaries of Indian agriculture. Therefore, it is of paramount importance to trace the changing trajectories of the agrarian crisis in order to understand various contemporary agrarian unrests. Impact of the British rule, a historical backdrop. The agrarian crisis sprouted during the imperialist rule with the introduction of Rayatwari and the Zamindari system that had laid the foundations of a capitalist form of agriculture. Due to commercialization of agriculture, emphasis of cultivation of crash crops like sugarcane and cotton due to rising demands. The agrarian economy under the British Raj envisaged crises like subdivision and fragmentation of land, rise in rural debt, exploitation of tenants, poverty, etc. Consequently, the peasant rose in discontent, manifested in movements and protests like Champaran peasant movement, Mopala rebellion, Bijolia movement of India, and Indian revolt of 1857. Government did try to introduce some reforms, but they were mostly in favor of the land owning classes. The poor farmers were in no position to cultivate commercial crops as they were constrained with limited resources and small land holdings. The large landholders stayed unaffected by the forces of production, as the loss incurred would be covered by lowering the wages of the laborers and increasing the price of the surplus food grains. On the whole, the reforms could not meet the desired results. Caste and land reforms, the alienated peasant. Government introduced various policies and programs to counterpunch agricultural crisis. The upper caste benefited from the position on the British Raj and they were intermediaries of British administration. On a contrast, the lower caste members provided various types of labor services. Thus, British Raj did not interrupt the traditional rigid caste structure called the Balutedari system in India. Each caste remained as an occupational group. This division of labor provided necessary cohesiveness among the rural community, which were characterized by strong kinship ties. Gradually in the 20th century, the lower caste peasantry developed caste consciousness and expressed the discontentment in the form of protest and movements regarding exploitative land and labor credit relations and economic equality amongst caste groups. Planned efforts were made to provide justice to lower caste by distribution of land, imposition of ceiling measures like abolition of intermediaries. Land reforms failed to achieve desired benefits to all members of the peasantry, but it did bring some relief in the form of positive impacts in states like West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. Agrarian crisis. British dominance laid the foundation for a situation of unrest in Indian agriculture with rigid caste structure that acted as a nexus between them. Reforms that were introduced, keeping in mind the interest of the farmers, only worsened the conditions further because it required inputs that were scarce, unaffordable, and the means to achieve them were marginal and required further investment. Green Revolution, a boon or a bane? Green Revolution was introduced in 1960s with the advent of high-yielding variety seeds. The water seed fertilizer strategy and associated land and crop-related rural credit facilities seemed promising. The first phase of the Green Revolution was confined to a few food crops, and the second phase of the Green Revolution extended to non-food crops like cotton. The agriculture before the 1960s was closely integrated to the village economy and had marginal connections to the markets outside. The villages were self-sufficient, the seeds were exchanged within farming community, and the seeds were prepared traditionally by selecting them from the best lot of crops. The production and distribution of new varieties of seeds were undertaken by the government through institutions set up for the purpose. It was after the implementation of the Green Revolution that the farmers could again hope for a secured occupational life and thus better socio-economic conditions. Green Revolution also shaped a new social structure by gradually minifying the monopoly of the upper caste on the Indian agriculture. The lower caste, who till now provided for the laborers, could now hope to watch closely the prosperity that the upper caste enjoyed. The newly introduced endeavors such as availability of land, low-cost credit, usage of high-yielding variety seeds that fetched good profit appeared as a promising resort to a better life. The emerging movement in favor of the low-caste members furthered their socio-economic aspiration. The new social order challenged the historical and traditional authority of the members of high caste by restraining their social control and land holding beyond the prescribed ceiling limit. Green Revolution enabled rise in income of all classes of peasantry, but soon it was realized that this was initial and short-lived. Endeavors to expand irrigational facilities left out few states, and the area under irrigation did not increase substantially. Resultantly, the cultivation of high water-seeking crops was left to vagaries of monsoon. Furthermore, the new high-yielding variety seeds required high doses of pesticides, fertilizers and other farm inputs, resulting in a rise cost of cultivation. Lack of proper knowledge about farming and agriculture among the farmers, that is also an issue in contemporary India, renders them partially or little competent in the skills that Green Revolution required. They were poor in dealing with modernized institutions and were little enlightened about access to crucial services like warehousing, insurance, export, etc. Impact of economic liberalization, transition in the macroeconomic policy regime. Neoliberal regime has impacted adversely on the country's agrarian economy. Given the WTO commitments, a progressive opening up the domestic agriculture to world market since the second half of the 1990s has been reason for considerable distress for farmers in general, while more severe among the others growing cotton and plantation crops. All these factors, coupled with the marked withdrawal of the state, which affected the investment in core areas like health, education, infrastructure, etc. Removal of quantitative restrictions on agriculture imports in the year 2001 exposed the Indian peasantry to fluctuation of the global market, thereby imposing substantial loss on them. The neoliberal regime was also held responsible for increasing the input prices and cost of cultivation on the whole. Agricultural subsidies saw nosedive, resulting in increased agricultural costs. Most of the state trading agencies for trading in agriculture commodities were removed and the products were brought under open general license. Rural credit and price policy, inadequate public investment. In the post-reform period, agriculture saw a continuous downtrend in the share of public sector in rural credit. The initial policy of low input and low output prices got replaced by high input and high output prices. Private sector emerged in the 1980s and took over the seed market by adequately meeting the demands of high yielding variety seeds. Consequently, the share of private sector investments in agriculture saw a considerable increase, while the share of public sector investment gradually disintegrated. There was a marked rise in tariffs and retraction of fertilizer subsidy. Scholars argue that beside the credit institutions set up with the purpose to extend credit to the farmers, the sources of credit available to farmers are commission agents, dealers and sub-dealers of pesticides and private sources who charge exorbitant rates. Sharp rise in agricultural cost. With the commercialization of agriculture comes the need for peasants to use modern techniques of agriculture and include better infrastructure like better pesticides and insecticides, fertilizers, irrigational facilities and other better modern technologies. High input prices and limited credit extensions are major causes of distress among the farmers. Lack of crucial provisions like irrigation from the state forces them to dig bore wells, the expenditure of which is incurred by them alone. Necessitated deepening of wells and in-well bores require investment of around 50,000 rupees to 1 lakh. These crucial requisites, along with the marked decline in agricultural subsidies, adulterated insecticides, pesticides and fertilizers, poor quality of seeds, poor harvest have furthered the trouble for the peasant. The overuse and misuse of pesticide not only inflates the cost of cultivation but also leads to decreased yield due to the problems of harmful residues. Pest resurgence, development of insects resistant to insecticides and ecological upheavals. Unremunerated prices, vicissitudes of international market. The free trade agreement among different nations has definitely broadened the means to attain better standard of living by making the initially far-reached good available to the common man. But it has also exposed the Indian agricultural market to the global competition. The consequences of economic liberalization lowered the prices of many agricultural products. A removal of restriction on imports and reduction in tariff has led to large-scale import of agricultural products that pushes the Indian agricultural markets into a situation of uncertainty emerging from increased competition. Declining profitability of agriculture. A comparison between the ratios of total prices received by agricultural sector and that received by non-agricultural sector is one of the important economic indicators to assess which of the two sectors contribute more to the economic growth. The survey of NSS on situation assessment survey of income, expenditure and productive assets of farmers household states that only 3.8% of the farmer households surveyed could meet their monthly consumption expenditure. The others ran in deficit. Likewise, the input-output price parity comparing the cost of input and prices received for output was unfavorable in the 80s. Though things changed in the early 90s, but since 1994-95 remained lower than 100, indicating declining profitability of agriculture. Natural factors and environmental problems, vagaries of nature. Agriculture in India is a gamble with monsoon is a popular fact known to everyone. Our geography books provide proper evidence to maintain monsoon in India is very erratic. Variations in the moods of the rain gods result into frequent occurrence of flood in some places and droughts in the others. Climatic changes and other factors are responsible for outbreak of crop diseases which bring substantial loss to the peasants. Land degradation and erosion due to overuse of land and cultivation and excessive use of fertilizer and soil erosion mainly due to deficit rainfall and deforestation and some major environmental bottlenecks for the Indian peasantry. Lack of proper knowledge and expertise. One of the most crucial factors that usually contribute to agrarian unrest is the lack of proper knowledge of newly introduced farming techniques. The complex economic policies introduced and institutions set up in the name of agricultural support. The complex economic policies and financial institutions requires the peasantry to look up to intermediaries to seek help from financial institutions regarding important financial matters like rural credit, loans, grants, and other complex deals. These intermediaries are the agents who work for the commission. They sometimes charge exorbitant amounts from the peasants, and the peasants who are already low on land holdings have to sell away the little that they have. Furthermore, due to lack of education, it becomes difficult for farmers to keep pace with the newly introduced techniques of agriculture. Therefore, crop failures may sometimes also result due to wrong farming techniques employed. Land acquisition by the government, fragmentation and subdivision of land. Land contributes as a fundamental factor of production in agricultural sector. Therefore, it is easily susceptible to various debates and issues regarding its use and ownership. Government has been exceedingly acquiring lands from the poor for developmental purposes. Sometimes these lands are fertile, uncultivable land that are required, and the compensation is only in cash. The poor farmers who are ignorant about investment plans and strategies end up using the money for unproductive personal use and hence get caught in the dual situation of poverty and landlessness. Fragmentation and subdivision of land is one of the alarming concerns in contemporary agricultural situation. Failure and decline of irrigational investment and corruption. A sharp decline in the productivity and profitability of agriculture is being attributed to the poor and meager means of irrigation. In India, only 46.1% of the agricultural land has irrigational facilities, that too under wells and bore wells. Depletion of groundwater due to poor monsoon is one of the major concerns of the agricultural sectors today, as it generates drought conditions. There is an inequity in the distribution of water which can well be attributed for the decline in cotton cultivation in Maharashtra and other states, causing suicides, epidemic in other worst hit areas. In India, the government makes policies and plans, improvements, none of which ever gets manifested into an action because of corruption. If at all programs are conceived, planned and implemented, they are done in a fragmented, scattered way, wholly guided by bureaucracy with no mechanism to manage the works. Furthermore, the government officials on various levels of administration reserve a part of the funds granted for agricultural purpose for their own ends. Hence, the plans introduced and policies created barely meet implementation. Government encouraged sustainability by way of groundwater conservation, water harvesting and construction of aquifers for all that depended hugely on the much awaited and erratic monsoon. It is because of irregular and scanty rainfall that crop failures are an annual routine. New agriculture, new order, increased individualization. It is argued that the modern agriculture changed the social structure of the rural society and has led to disintegration of the feeling of community. The rural life encountered some profound changes. The fragmentation of joint families and weakening of kinship ties were some results of modernization, planning, spread of urban values and education. The recent emerging trends in agriculture is one where cultivators bind ties with the market and not with each other. Agriculture thus becomes an independent business. The new agricultural practices have restricted interactions between the farmers regarding exchange of labor service and other farming assistance. Individualism seeped in as a voluntary efforts towards population stabilization were given impetus to. In addition, large landholders, in order to protect the land from being subjected to sealing laws, partitioned their holdings. Suicide, the ultimate respite. Despite the sequential agrarian modifications that were introduced with best interests, there rose an individualistic orientation due to the new agricultural practices driven by competition. It broke down the kinship ties and community feelings, and the idea of traditional family became obsolete. There emerged a rising disproportion between the farmers' socio-economic expectations and aspirations. Drawing from the theoretical framework of suicide provided by Durkheim, the farmer suicides in India are compatible with economic suicide, accompanied by and resulting from rising egoism in rural society. The leaching cotton miseries of the cotton cultivator. Suicides occurred among small and marginal farmers growing cotton that is influenced by unfavorable markets. Growing a commercial crop like cotton required huge investment in terms of seeds and pesticides and technical expertise, lack of which pushed farmers to traditionally manually deal with the situation at household level. They ended up selling their land and wives' jewelries to accumulate sufficient fund to dig bore wells that would ease farming from vagaries of monsoon or never met government aid. Frequent power cut and groundwater depletion made all the digging dysfunctional. Massive crop failure came to happen, and crop insurance that seemed the only last hope for sustenance had nothing to offer, since private loans did not come under the aegis of crop insurance. The ailing occupation haunted the farmers, and they took respite in consuming the very poison they failed to kill the pests in their farms. Evidences from across the country. In Andhra Pradesh, an analysis of cotton cultivation with reference to Warangal districts suggests that indebtedness and instability in produce were the reasons that farmers took to suicide. But there was still more to it that came to the fore when Nirmala illustrated an analysis of 30 suicide cases that social disintegration and detachment from the community were undesirable additions to the miseries of the diseased farmers. In Karnataka, it was noted that in Bidar district, more than crop loss, it was the devastated community relations between the farmers that enhanced their miseries. Deshpande in his study also revealed that nucleated family patterns, lack of integration, family and conjugal tensions provided sufficient cause for suicide. Shah has argued that suicides were possible also because of various social reasons like gambling habits and drinking. In Maharashtra, suicide generally took place in Vidarbha region. Mohanty noted that small farmers belonging majorly to lower castes took to suicide when agricultural laws failed to meet their aspirations for better socio-economic conditions. He also noted caste-based isolation, detachment from family, and individualism in agriculture. The study also reveals that suicide amongst the large and medium farmers who belonged majorly to higher caste was attributed to loss in business and politics. In Punjab, 80 cases indicating suicide were prominent among youth, which indicated the alienation with agriculture in view of urban lifestyle and family disintegration. So, having understood this module from various perspectives given by various scholars, now we know that one of the ways of understanding this peculiar problem of farmer suicides is by going back to the framework of Durkheim, wherein Durkheim tries to assess the European situation in the 19th century. These scholars have tried to use the same kind of framework, but a different kind of a situation and a different nation altogether. Now, it is not surprising that the findings suggest that Durkheim's theory still has a high level of accuracy in determining the causes and determining the types of suicide cases that have taken place in the country. Post 1991, in the era of LPG, we have seen our farmers are now living a new kind of a life where consumerism has become part and parcel of their life. In order to live up to that kind of an image that they have built in society and that kind of acceptability that they have received from society, most of these farmers take huge loans from money lenders, and this in turn finally leads to ending their life through egoistic suicide. There are also instances wherein there are structural changes that have actually led to financial crunches and to deprivation of the agricultural sector overall. And this has finally led to a large scale increase in the rate of farmer suicides in India.